Guests murmured in excitement as the music swelled, signaling the bride's entrance. She took a deep breath, her heart pounding with anticipation. This was the moment she had dreamed of, walking down the aisle, the love of her life waiting at the other end. But just as she took her first step, a sudden movement caught her eye. Her loyal golden retriever, Max, dashed in front of her, planting himself firmly on the path. At first, she smiled, thinking he was excited. But then she noticed something strange. His eyes filled with desperation, as if he was pleading with her to stop. Max had always been her shadow, a constant source of love and comfort. As she approached the aisle, she expected him to wag his tail happily. Instead, he stood rigid, ears perked, blocking her path. His unusual stillness sent a ripple of unease through her chest. Max didn't budge. His golden fur bristled slightly as he stood firm, his body a barrier between the bride and the aisle. She laughed nervously, glancing at her guests, expecting someone to call him away, but he didn't move. Instead, he let out a low whine, his eyes locked onto hers, filled with something she couldn't quite place. Worry, urgency, maybe even fear. She reached down, gently touching his head, but he stepped back, his paws pressing harder into the ground. Murmurs spread through the crowd as the groom took a step forward, concern etched on his face. Something wasn't right. Max wasn't playing. He was trying to tell her something. The bride's heart pounded as she knelt beside Max, searching his face for answers. His breathing was quick, his ears twitching at the slightest sound. Then he turned his head slightly, his nose pointing toward the ground. Confused, she followed his gaze, her fingers trembling as they brushed against the soft fabric of her gown. That's when she noticed it, a faint, almost imperceptible sound beneath the floral archway. A muffled whimper. Her breath hitched. She looked back at Max, who let out another desperate whine. This wasn't about her. He wasn't stopping her out of excitement. He was protecting something or someone. A sudden chill ran through her as she lifted the edge of her gown, following Max's lead. Beneath the archway, just a few feet away, something small stirred. A gasp escaped her lips as she stepped closer, heart pounding in her chest. There, curled up in the folds of the white fabric, was a tiny, shivering puppy, barely a few weeks old. Its fur was matted, its body frail, and its eyes, barely open, looked up at her with silent desperation. Tears welled in her eyes as realization struck. Max hadn't been blocking her path. He had been guarding the helpless creature, refusing to let the ceremony continue until someone noticed. He knew, he had sensed its fear, its weakness, its need for help. A hush fell over the guests as the bride gently scooped up the trembling puppy, cradling it in her arms. Max let out a relieved sigh, his tail wagging softly as if he finally trusted that she understood. The groom stepped forward, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder, his eyes filled with admiration. Tears blurred her vision as she whispered, "You were protecting him, weren't you, Max?" At that moment she knew. This wasn't just a wedding day, it was a reminder of love in its purest, most selfless form. As the ceremony continued, the tiny puppy remained nestled safely in the bride's arms, a symbol of fate's unexpected twists. Max had reminded everyone that love isn't just spoken in vows, it's shown in the smallest, most selfless acts. Have you ever witnessed an animal's incredible instinct? Share your story in the comments below.